Now we're going to talk about importing data into the Sentinel database, and we're going to use phone calls as an example. The first thing I'm going to do is call up the visualizer, and we're going to have a blank slate here. And there are different ways that we can visualize a phone call. It can be something as simple as John makes a phone call to Jane, and the relationship between the two people is, in fact, a phone call. And just FYI, these are the different relationships that I have in my database. You will have different relationship types, fewer, more, whatever you want. This just happens to be in my database. So anyway, this is one way to visualize a phone call. John places a phone call to Jane. Now, if you want to get technical about it, it's actually the phone number that calls the other phone number. So in fact, the relationship is that one phone number places a call to another phone number, and a person owns that phone, and another person owns this phone. So the relationship between the person and the phone is that they have or own the phone. And Jane lives at a location, as does John. And so the relationship between the person and the location, or the home, is that they reside at. And other people might live at that location as well. And in fact, if you want to get technical about it, it's the phone tower that really makes the phone call and not the phone itself. The point being, we took a very simple visualization of a phone call and made it very detailed. So one of the things you're going to have to decide is how you want to visualize your data. So now let's take some actual data, and I happen to have two spreadsheets here. I have what is in effect a phone book, a phone number, the type of phone, who owns the phone, and the street address where they live, and a set of call records. So the first thing we're going to do is import our phone book. We're going to call up the spreadsheet. Where it gives me a preview of the data. My leftmost column is a phone number, so that's going to be an entity. So I'm going to drag the line here, and these are the different entity types in my database. Again, you will have different ones. You'll have more, you'll have less, whatever ones you want. But this is a phone number. The second column, the type of phone, is what we call metadata. That's information that describes the entity. And by the way, these are all the different kinds of metadata that I have in my database. Again, you will have different ones, more, less, whatever. Then the third column is an owner, and so that's going to be a person. Again, we're going to drag this line over, and the entity type is a person. And metadata is where they live. In this example, it's a street address. I could have city, state, zip, but I'm just kind of keeping it simple here. And the relationship is that this person has or owns this phone. So again, in a phone book, in this data, right here, this is the phone book, and the relationship is that this person has or owns this phone. So I'm going to import this data. And if we go back to the visualizer and call up an entity, we will visualize the phone book. And so here, Ed has or owns this phone. Let's call up another one. And in this case, Mary has or owns this phone. So I'm visualizing the phone book because that's the only data I have in here up to this point. Now let's import this set of call records. So we're going to go back to our import data screen. We're going to call up the spreadsheet that has my call records. Again, it gives me a preview of data. And my leftmost column is a phone number. So I'm going to make that a phone number entity type. My second column also is a phone number. Now, if those phone numbers already exist in the database, we will not duplicate the phone numbers unless you want to on purpose. You can on purpose, but it will not default to duplicating. And any information that exists will roll up into the entity that already is in the database. So the relationship is that this phone number placed a phone call to this phone number. So again, these are all my relationships, and this is a phone call. Now, although this is a perfectly acceptable type of relationship, in this example, I happen to have the type of phone call that it occurs, so I can make that the relationship. And I can also take the date and make that the start and end date. So this is my data map from taking from my spreadsheet into Sentinel. Now when we import this data, and we go back to our visualizer, if I take a look at Ed Sims, just like I did before, I can see that he owns this phone just like I did before. However, when I expand on his phone number, I can now see which phone calls he made based on these call records that we imported. So when I go back to the visualizer, and if I expand on one of these phone numbers, I can now redraw my network and see not only that Ed, if I used my shortest path tool, called Jane, so Ed owns this phone, made a local call to this phone, which is owned by Jane. But if I use my all paths tool, I can see they both called this phone number. And there's just no way you could have discovered that relationship by looking at this list of phone calls. That's what data visualization is. So as I expand these phone numbers, I'm creating this network of phone calls, and I can start seeing all the relationships by all the people. If I want to zoom in on George and see that he owns this phone and who he called. So the point is, by importing this phone book and then by importing the call records, it created this network of phone calls and relationships that's much easier to see through data visualization than just through text.